Welcome to the Deep Shiz podcast. I'm Jeff,
I'm Eric.
and we're doing part four today of the documentary to September 11th, The New Pearl Harbor. Last time we left off on still skyscrapers have never collapsed as a result of burning, and they went over the structure of the buildings. Now they're asking the question, what could have caused the initial collapse, which is a very interesting question. Because when you're watching 9/11, when you were watching 9/11, it was like, oh yeah, of course, buildings collapse. But then you realize, when you really think about it, it's like buildings don't collapse like that just by themselves. Didn't really make a lot of sense from a scientific standpoint.
Yeah, there was something unintuitive about it. I remember seeing it in middle school or high school at the time, and seeing the collapse after the explosions that occurred, and just thinking that something seems off about this. I hadn't gone and got my engineering degree or anything at that point, but something did seem strange about the collapse, even as an uninitiated teenager.
I didn't even think of it, so you must have been more talented than I was because I was just like, whatever. Oh, that sucks. I wasn't thinking, I'm like, that's terrible, but I wasn't thinking really critically about it. You just don't question these things until someone poses the question. So, yeah, it doesn't make sense that the top one fifth, the top one sixth of a structure could collapse and then destroy the rest of it. You know, they call it the pancake theory that the floors just kind of collapsed and kept collapsing somehow. It doesn't take in. They were talking about how it doesn't take into account the interior core, that because the structure was made up of floors, some outside tendrils, and then an inner core. So the pancake theory didn't explain how the inner core was destroyed.
Yes, I believe the official NIST story is that the fires were causing the support beams between the outside and inside structures to sag and compromise those structures. And there's so many issues with that. First, the heat was fairly low, and the areas where it was high enough to weaken the steel, it was fairly localized areas. So you could expect to see some compromise in the structure there. But as far as the rest of the structure, that is totally intact, and it is built to a 4 to 20 times overkill or redundancy. So to expect the localized damage to destroy the entire structure is a non-starter on its face.
It doesn't make sense. They were saying how the trusses were sagging, like it didn't need to melt. It just had to be soft enough to sag, and somehow the weight of the trusses pulled in the walls of the building, and it started this collapse. But those trusses weren't heavy enough to pull in the sides of the building, not even close. And they also went into later on how the temperatures weren't even close to even soften steel, which soften is like just partially melts. That's like just the beginning of melting. So that's how kind of, from what I understand, to melt metal, you get it to a point as it becomes softened, it's basically really close to melting anyway. So it's not like the temperature to soften metal is like really close to the temperature to melt it. So it didn't really help their argument at all.
No, and even with a localized weakening of the steel, the trusses are still mounted and bolted to the columns. So even if you do have some sagging, the attachment is still made between those structural members, and the columns are already holding the trusses to begin with. So if the trusses sag a little bit, it's not going to compromise the larger columns. Uh, so so yeah, this is all just to say that NIST kind of throws out these explanations, but upon further scrutiny, they just don't stand up.
What was this?
National Institute of Science and Technology, I believe,
So they were the people
and they're
hired to debunk the naysayers, basically.
to come up with the official reason why the collapse initiated, and then the rest they didn't address.
And they said also that the impact of the planes dislodged the fireproofing, and that's how everything was able to get so hot because there's fireproofing in the building. Apparently, both buildings got hit exactly in the right way to dislodge all of the. That's pretty crappy fireproofing. But they also argued that the building was rigid, and so when it started like collapsing, it all just kind of, I guess, it started falling apart, like it was brittle. But it was actually pretty elastic.
Yeah, I think the head engineer is on the record saying that, or a an analyst who was investigating said, and I forget if this was before or after the attack. And he said that the live loads could be increased 20 times, and the structure would not fail, which just shows the strength of the building. And another interesting thing about that is that this design is very successful. This type of design of building, it's been used all over the place. And in fact, the replacement for Building 7 followed the same design, which just goes to show that this design is not compromised or critically flawed. And another item about the fireproofing, once again, the damage was localized, so you could have fireproofing weakened in some areas, but the rest of the structure is still intact. And there are so many accounts of witnesses saying like, oh yeah, the plane hit, I heard the big noise, but like my desk was totally undisturbed. I had this little trinket. It was a little sailing ship, and it didn't even fall over at my desk.
Yeah, that's what McIntyre was saying. He was a few floors below the point of impact, where everything was on fire, and his pictures on his walls didn't even fall. He was in his office, his picture of his wife and kids. They didn't even fall off the wall. So to say that the fireproofing was dislodged is like, that doesn't hold a lot of water. And then they go into the temperatures not being hot enough even to weaken steel or cause them to sag. It was really interesting that they also said that NIST used their own models and their own calculations, but wouldn't hand over their proof or their reports. They just wouldn't let scientists like look at them. So it's like, what are you hiding there?
Yes, just like all the other elements of 9/11, there's so much secrecy and hiding that is a clear indicator of foul play. There's one of the fellows, the head of architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, Richard Gage. There's a clip in there of him talking about, hey, we need to do an analysis and see the NIST data on their pancake theory, because we should be able to see how much energy is dissipated by every floor as it hits the subsequent floor beneath it. And of course, that data has not been made available. And the reason why is because it would show that pancake theory is not viable. I think the official reason they gave is it would jeopardize public safety, which is, of course, just an out for them.
That's just a general boilerplate thing to say. Oh, geez. Yeah. And, I don't think there's evidence of how hot the columns got, and I think the max they saw was 250 degrees Celsius. But even to soften, you need to be at 600 degrees Celsius. So they failed to even produce. There was like an infrared image was taken, and the temperatures didn't even reach 120 degrees Celsius in that image. So there's really no evidence that there was enough heat to even soften the beams.
Was this before the collapse? Was that when that thermal image was taken?
It was before the collapse, and afterwards you had a lot of heat just from from all the friction from everything falling. So that's not conclusive either way. But
I think the next section will cover that.
Right.
The very hot temperatures after the collapse.
Yeah. There's extremely hot temperatures afterwards, but that's because everything was falling. It's like the kinetic energy was all producing so much friction and everything. But back to this heat thing, 16 people said they made down the steps past the damaged floors, and the debunkers were like, well, the floors were on the edge of the building, but actually that was a lie. The floors were in the center of the building. The buildings went the stairways, actually. The stairways went from outside the building to the inside to the outside. They would kind of go back and forth. But on these floors, the stairways were on the inside. So they just keep making these arguments that are just blatantly false and everything. So
I think it's the role of the debunkers. Like they need to throw things out there that sound like viable explanations. And what I find amazing is how quick they are to say what the situation was or what actually happened, even though they were not there. Meanwhile, you have
Yeah.
witnesses who are totally contradicting them who were actually there and who have nothing to gain by, and a lot of times they're just interviewed by a cameraman. Um, and so I think that is got to be taken into consideration when considering the debunkers' arguments.
Yeah, it's true. And like most of the building wasn't even damaged before it collapsed. So it's like, how did it become structurally weak below the point of impact when it was already all of that was? I mean, the trusses weren't, you know, damaged below with a point of impact. So even from an intuitive standpoint, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. And
No, and that kind of gets into, I think in the next section they talk a little bit about the free fall speed of the collapse. So even if you had the pancake theory, you couldn't fall at a free fall rate. The buildings fell at very close to a free fall or at free fall. And uh, with all that intact structure, the 80% of the buildings that were not damaged, um, that would have slowed the damaged portion down, and in fact would have stopped it very rapidly. And so the case they make, and I think they can do it very convincingly, is that the structure was removed underneath the damage zone at the time of the collapse or as part of.
if in order for the top part to fall at near free fall speeds, anywhere close to free fall speeds, you would need to remove the whatever was below it, and that's what each explosion was. It was removing it one at a time, and it was pretty expertly done because they showed video footage of other buildings being demolished, and they didn't fall as like straight down. Sometimes they'd go over to the side a little bit. So they must have really had some professionals time this perfectly.
Yes, that would be an interesting deep dive. There's only so many people in the world who know how to do this type of work. There's like 2 companies that do controlled demolitions in the United States and a few international ones.
Yeah.
And so the skill set is extremely small. And I wonder if anyone has kind of done some digging as to who would have been able to rig those explosives and plan it as part of taking the buildings down.
I wonder if you could just ask, you just watch that, the 9/11, the buildings collapsing with someone who does demolition as like a profession. Ask them, is that even possible without explosives? And if it were, why would you use explosives? Just start burning the building, and it'll just collapse eventually. That's just a lot cheaper,
Start an
right?
office fire.
He'd be like, "Wait, what am I doing with my life? I went to school for 4 years on, majored in destroying buildings, and all we have to do is just get some Molotov cocktails and burn it down."
So it's funny you mentioned that, Jeff, because there's literally a Dutch guy or a Danish guy, I forget, and he watches the video of one of the collapses, and someone asks him, the interviewer asks him, "What is happening here?" He's like, "That's a controlled demolition, and it's expertly done, without a doubt." And he's like the top of the industry in Europe. A few
Jeez.
years later, a few months later, he's driving his car and dies in a car crash.
Oh, I think most people on an intuitive level know there's something dangerous about saying anything too weird. They just don't. Maybe they don't know how exactly why it's dangerous, but they're just like, I better not get too far off the beaten path here because I don't want to be disappeared. Oh boy.
Yes.
But they did. There were a ton of engineers challenging the official story, though, and the debunkers just called them gymnasium builders, which I guess is a derogatory term
Mm-hmm.
in civil engineering. Civil engineering, because it's the lowest of the low engineers. Apparently, just the flunkies or like the guys who got by on D's or something. They just build gymnasiums because they're easy to build. Apparently, even though none of them have any background in engineering themselves, but they were saying that they don't have any engineering background, even though they're all engineers. So they just flat out lie. I mean, gosh, there's just so much to get to here. This is like a very dense, science-heavy section, so there's a lot to go over, but we don't have to get to everything. But so the debunker said to that was like, well, it would be impossible to wire the buildings. I think most people would actually think that. Like, how would you wire the buildings with explosives if there's so many people in there? But if you've ever been in any kind of building that's like 30 stories tall, you know there's areas you can't like, access. There's tons of doors you can't go into that are like personnel only. Even in restaurants, there's like you can't go past there because it's employees only. It wouldn't be that hard. I think a couple of coworkers or workers were saying there was a lot of like construction noises going on. They felt the floor shaking. So they could just say, "Hey, we're doing renovations on this floor," and nobody's gonna ask any questions.
Well, and that's exactly what was going on. I think there was in the documentary they talked about, there was a recabling exercise, and they had these power downs where all the security systems were turned off and all the systems. Um, so all the badge readers and all the locks were disabled. And this was all in the run up to the attacks. The bomb sniffing dogs were removed. Um, there were all
Jeez.
these heavy items being moved around on the empty floors. So uh, that was deliberate. The Port Authority was the owner of the building, and they could definitely coordinated that. Um, and then once again, it's like all these things stacking on top of each other. Um, Engineers coming in and messing with cables doesn't look at all odd to anyone who's like, oh yeah, that's just some construction going on until after the fact.
Just dress them up
Um,
like engineers and not men in black suits or anything. Just dress them up like professionals. But there's also an elevator modernization program going on, and you can access the whole core from the elevators. So that could have been part of it too.
oh, totally. So one of the biggest elevator installers is Otis, and they've been around forever, and they had the normal contract for the Twin Towers. Well, right before, in the year preceding 9/11, a company that no one had ever heard of, Ace Elevator, got the contract to
Oh,
maintain and replace those elevators. So, and of course, they disappeared right after 9/11. This was their only contract. So, in a normal world, you'd say, why risk your elevators with this unknown company? Uh, what's what seems most likely is that this was a front company that either was granted cover or access to the columns for whoever installed those charges, whether it was actual ASIM elevator employees or another group of people working for one of the secret agencies. But that's a clearly like a cutout of saying, okay, we have this company that is very well known. They've got a reputation to guard, but we're going to replace them. And the only reason that could be done is for this deliberate purpose. Um, it's just that something like that just doesn't happen by chance.
absolutely. Gosh, that's pretty suspicious. Just a company's formed just for this one. I mean, they have no experience, like because you want a company that has a ton of experience, so they know what they're doing, right? So that's so weird. The debunkers then said the demolition always starts from the bottom, so it wouldn't make sense that it would start from the top, which is not. It's also just a blatant lie. You can watch a lot of the videos they showed of other demolitions. They would start from the middle or the bottom or the top, just whatever the needs were. So that was
Mm.
they just lie here.
One thing that I noticed the debunkers doing was they kind of portrayed any type of infiltration or installation of these explosives as like a 007 type operation with men in black running around with suits and everything. Really,
Yeah,
and that of course makes it seem much more far fetched. But in reality, it's people in coveralls running wires, bolting things to columns, running connectors, drilling holes, stuff that you normally see when you're maintaining a building. To the uneducated eye or the person not in the know, it would just look like the average blue collar worker running some new conduit for to upgrade the network.
yep. You could make the bombs, put the bombs in like boxes, metal boxes, and make the boxes look like I don't know, circuit breakers or some kind of random technical thing. Average person wouldn't, and the average person probably wouldn't even go in that area in the first place to see that. So it's easily not hard. I mean, this comes back to what we talked about last episode with compartmentalization. You just compartmentalize the people. So most of the normies just kind of go to their cubicles and then leave, and they just never go to the elevator shaft. outside the elevator. Where I mean, how many times have you seen an elevator shaft outside of movies? Never, because you're just in the elevator. You never see what's beyond the elevator. So,
Yeah. Touche.
and well, then the bunkers were like, well, there were no explosion, like noise of explosions, but then there's tons of video footage of people who witnessed the Twin Towers falling, who said they heard explosions. Their response to that was that people don't know what explosions sound like because most people don't hear them, and that's like fairly good argument. But then the firefighters said they heard explosions, and they're always in burning buildings where explosions happen often. So a lot of people heard explosions, so they just kind of lied about that. It's blatantly.
Oh yeah, and there's like a consistent pattern. There were several large ones that preceded the collapse, which would fit with the controlled demolition, where you weaken the structure before ultimately taking it down.
Right.
You correlate the sound of the explosions with what people saw, like in the lobby, and we'll probably get this pretty soon here, but where there was evidence of a bomb going off in the lobby from people who were coming down the stairs. They're like, "What blew up the lobby down here?"
That's a whole different thing. But before that, people, heard explosions. One guy actually got burned by an explosion. I wanted to talk about the preliminary explosion. So in a lot of those videos of other demolitions, you heard a ton of explosions before before the building even started falling. And so one argument they could make is that, well, we didn't hear any of those secondary explosions, but there were. They had to space them out. So that's what was happening. It's just instead of like doing like boom, 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 it was like boom, and then like a few minutes later, boom, and then they try to get space them out so it wasn't as obvious, but people still heard those explosions, and a lot of people are screaming. So in the videos you can't always hear it, but in a lot of videos you can because there's so much confusion that those explosions were. I wonder if they put like maybe like put those explosives in like areas where the noise would be muffled a little bit, maybe where people wouldn't hear it because the building was so hard. Maybe those explosions were so high up. But I'm not sure how that works. But people heard explosions though throughout the whole ordeal.
A number of explosions were heard down in the basement, very low.
Right. Yeah.
And then, of course, those are some of the big ones. And then running up to the final collapse, there was a whole variety of explosions, including ones that sounded like little fireworks, just like chattering all over the place, which seems like cutting all the smaller columns and beams. So there's a variety of descriptions of these explosions, but there's a consistent pattern of them as well. You've got witnesses who are experts in explosions, and that is firemen and police officers saying multiple times that they were hearing explosions, and several of them going off.
I know, and the debunkers were saying that the jet fuel is what caused the explosions in the basement, but the jet fuel, they kind of described it like in the jets, each one had 50 cubic yards of jet fuel, but each building had over 2 million cubic yards of building space. So to pour just that tiny, relatively small amount of fuel down to the bottom, it wouldn't cause any explosions or any fires. 50 cubic yards is about the size of like a backyard pool, like one of those inflatable pools you have a family swimming in. So it's really not that much. Like it's a small pool. And they said that half the fuel was consumed in the initial crash and a lot more was burned. So it was more like 5 cubic yards. That's actually it. Sorry, 5 cubic yards is the size of a small family pool there. And so it's just ridiculous to say that 5 cubic yards of jet fuel made it all the way down, millions of cubic yards of building space down to the bottom to create an explosion.
Which destroyed the lobby.
Right. And
it's which is this huge part of the building.
But there's a guy who saw he's down in the lobby and he saw this like shattered glass. He's like, no, there's no way jet fuel caused this. This was like a bomb, and it's just weird because the lobby was hit way after the first collision of the first plane, So that's like, and a lot of these explosions happened before. Actually, that's it. A lot of these explosions happened before the plane hit, and there's these debunkers from Popular Mechanics, and the guy asked him about that, and they just like ignored the question basically and just repeated their typical answer. So it's
They have their
uh,
talking points.
yeah, it was just kind of weird that because the guy asked one of the Popular Mechanic guys outright, how could jet fuel cause that explosion when the explosion happened before the planes even hit? And they just didn't, they just kind of glossed over that. And then there was tons of eyewitnesses contradicted the jet fuel theory. Um, let's see, no explosion. Yeah, the debunker said there was no explosions, but there were explosions recorded. They actually showed them. Let's see here. Ron DeFrancesco saw an explosion. Actually, saw one of the explosions. His arms were burned, and his contacts were melted to his eyeballs. So that's like literally an eyewitness, and they just don't care about that. It's crazy. Any thoughts on that before we get to the squibs, which is my favorite part?
Yeah, there's
Not that any of
there's
this,
a
none of this is good, but the squibs are really interesting. But um,
no, I agree. But before we go on to that, it's just I think this section in the documentary is really well covered because after giving all the witnesses takes, from interviews and from journalists uh, uh, articles or newspaper articles, uh, they turn it back on anyone who's skeptical and says to doubt all these claims is not to have debunked the explosions. It's to willfully disregard all these eyewitnesses. An honest seeker of the truth would say, "Hey, what are you guys talking about?" And of course, the debunkers are operating not from an area of good faith, and they just are like, "Well, there weren't explosions." And when people say witnesses report many explosions, they say, "Well, gee, there weren't any recorded on film," so they just keep moving the goalposts. You can never convince them.
right. I mean, if it was like a real investigation for the 9/11 Commission, they would have had these people come in, and give testimony. But of course they didn't. They
That's a
didn't,
good point.
they didn't ask for any
Yeah,
eyewitnesses at all because they didn't want there to be any eyewitnesses to what actually did happen. Because they know what happened. They're just covering up. I think NIST was paid $20 million, and I wonder if maybe, I don't know, Joe Biden was on the board or something, or like he was like, or maybe some globalist was heading up that organization or something like that, because there's some shady things going
who
on there.
who's the guy who was behind the Trump dossier? Who is
I
uh,
don't remember.
Comey, or he's an FBI guy? Mueller.
Yeah,
I think he
Mueller.
was involved in some of this stuff.
Oh, you think
So
so?
these guys, well, I believe he was doing some of the like investigation work, which is just another way of saying cover up.
Mm,
So a lot of these guys are very deep operators, and they've been around doing this business for a while. Um, and yeah, it would have been interesting to kind of see what like an actual investigation would look like. I do think documentaries like this are part of that. But yeah, there were initially a lot of like honest investigators, but a number of them changed their minds. Universities would start saying, "Hey, this is probably a controlled demolition. Look at the way the collapse happened." And then you'd see these professors who were making those assessments, suddenly they would change their tune, and sure enough, their program just got a $20 million or $5 million
oh,
grant.
jeez. Yeah.
And then they changed, like, well, gee, the pancake theory is actually most likely, blah blah.
Gosh. Yeah, anyone can be bought, I guess, or intimidated, or just killed outright.
Yeah, mix of
And
both, or all three.
yeah, threatened to be killed or just killed if they don't cave in. Then the last thing they talked about before next time, and we'll go more into this next time, is the squibs. You can actually see that in the video of these plumes of air, but also concrete and other physical objects being ousted from the sides of the building as the building's collapsing, and below all the damage, which is characteristic of a controlled demolition. They even showed one clip, which was really sad, of a possible person being ousted from one of them. But the debunkers said, yeah, and the debunkers were saying that that was the result of the force of the falling floors, as if it was the air, and it just pushed out the windows. But you can see it's way more than just glass. It's like concrete and other physical objects from the floor. And the only thing that could create that kind of force would be explosions. But these squibs, yeah, those squibs are one of the biggest smoking guns. And the pancake theory does not even begin to explain this, because the squibs are way below the falling floors. Like, it was like squibs were like 20 floors below the destruction. So, I mean, you got your smoking gun, you got all this evidence, and most people don't listen. I really would be interested to see what the average person thinks of all of this, but I think the average person is just busy with their lives, and they're just happy to let bygones be bygones, and people in power to have power.